Welcome to The Jewish Lens, a podcast to discuss anything and everything from a Jewish perspective. Now, please help me welcome the man who controls the media, your host, Jonathan Rosen.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of The Jewish Lens. I'm Jonathan Rosen, and today I am thrilled to welcome a New York Times bestselling author and soap opera insider. She's a regular contributor to Today's Show Parenting, Feller, and Entertainment Weekly. She also has a new book, Go On Pretending, which is out now. Please help me welcome Alina Adams. Alina, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to look at the world through a Jewish lens.
Well, me too. Well, we have a lot to cover, but let me start by going back with you. So you were born in the former Soviet Union. So I'm always fascinated. What was life like for you there, especially with regard to Judaism? Could you observe it all?
Well, here's the situation. I was born in Odessa, USSR, a city that tragically over the last couple of years, people are a lot more familiar with than they used to be in the past. And while Odessa was a part of the USSR, and while Odessa was a part of the Ukraine, it was always an outlier in the sense that it had a disproportionately large Jewish population
Oh,
for
wow.
really
Okay.
anywhere. I believe at its height, it might have been more than 30%. So, growing up as a young child, I pretty much thought everyone was Jewish up until a certain point because it felt like such a large community without me realizing that it was just such a small community. And my parents came from very different backgrounds. So my father was born in 1941. For those who know their history, understand he was born in January of 1941. So you can imagine what his first couple of years of
Wow.
life were like. As he said, I was born in Kiev when they started bombing Kiev. We moved to Kharkiv. When they started bombing Kharkiv, we moved to
Oh,
Odessa. When they started bombing Odessa, his mother was actually a military nurse. So
oh,
he
wow.
grew up. His first couple of years were in army, like MASH units. I guess they weren't called MASH units, but that's what it was. But his mother came from a very observant family because they had been from a small shtetl. They were not from Odessa. So his mother had grown up observant. He lived with his mother and his aunt. His father was killed during World War II, as was very common at the time. So his mother would fast on Yom Kippur without ever saying why she was fasting, at least to me. His mother would go to a small synagogue on the edge of Odessa where she could get matzah for Passover without again explaining to me what was going on. On the other hand, her mother had been born in Odessa. Her father had owned a glass factory. They were in a very different social and socioeconomic strata. And her mother, my mother's mother, was very proud of the fact that her children did not speak Yiddish because that showed how cosmopolitan they were. That showed how assimilated they were. On the other hand, my mother's father had also grown up in a tiny shtetl called Valta, where his own father didn't even speak Russian because he didn't need to.
Hmm.
All they had to do was speak Yiddish. On the other hand, when my grandfather was at the age of 13, okay, I don't know how many of you have kids around that age. My daughter, excuse me, sorry about that.
Oh,
My daughter, a couple of years ago, she competed in the Maccabi Games
oh,
in Israel, and she was, I think, 15 at the time. And I was saying to her, "Do you have your passport? Do you have your paperwork? Do you know who you're going to meet with?" My grandfather, at 13 years old, 13, left his little shtetl by himself to
wow.
move to Odessa, to work in a factory during the day, to go to school at night. And here's the piece de resistance of this story. His father wrote a letter to Joseph Stalin
I was going to ask
in
you about that. I saw that in your site. That's incredible to me. Yeah, it's okay. I'm
yeah,
sorry.
he wrote a letter to Joseph Stalin in Yiddish, thanking him for the fact that his son, a little Jewish boy from a nothing
Wow.
shtetl called Malta, it's not there anymore, had the opportunity to be educated in Stalin's USSR. So my grandparents came from very different backgrounds. As I said, my grandfather's father didn't even speak Russian, and after most Jewish culture was outlawed, he would listen to Romanian records because Romanian would remind him a little bit of Yiddish.
That's unbelievable to me. So there was, so it's not like I was picturing in my mind. So in your area, at least, there was a Jewish life outside your home. You could go ahead and practice and not worry about anything outside your.
No, 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 no. It was done in secret
Oh,
It
okay.
was done, as I said, my father's mother would go off and get some matzah, but not tell anyone what she was doing. And no, I had no idea about Jewish holidays. I had no idea about any Jewish practices. The only connection was the fact that the older people in the household would speak Yiddish if they
Right.
didn't want to understand. And my father actually did understand Yiddish because his mother and aunt did speak Yiddish to him. On the other hand, my mother grew up in a household where, as I said, my grandmother was very proud of the fact that her children did not speak Yiddish because that shows how sophisticated they were. I'll actually even tell you another little story. So my father, who was born in 1941, was named Genrich, which is more of a German name.
Mhm.
His mother actually called him Gairik, which is more of a Yiddish name. When he started a Soviet school at 6 years old, his teacher informed him, Genrik, that's not a Russian name. Your name is now Igor, and we will call you Igor. So for most of it, even though all his legal documents said Genrik, my father was Igor, and he didn't actually go back to being Genrik. I didn't even know that was his name until we moved to the United States. And since that was his legal name, and honestly, that's the name he always thought of himself. He always thought of himself as Gaidik because that's what his family called him, but it was a Jewish name. So he was Igor in school.
Oh, wow, that's fascinating. So, again, I'm curious about things there too, because when I was growing up, there were always things being done. I was living in New York. I grew up, always things being done for the Jews of the Soviet Union, and I lived in Israel for a time as a kid, and met a lot of Russian Jews there as well. So, what was everyday life like? Did you feel oppression at all? Like, I mean, you said a little bit that you would this was done in secret, but did you feel oppression, like I guess, in day-to-day life?
Here's the thing, I was a child. My family left the Soviet Union actually the day before my seventh birthday. Oh, and fun fact, I didn't know we were leaving the Soviet Union forever because my parents were afraid that if they told me, I would tell somebody else. So I had no idea why everyone was so upset. I thought we were just getting on a train for a little trip. It was the day before my seventh birthday. So here's what I will tell you. There was oppression that I didn't understand.
Okay,
Because when you are a child, you think everyone lives the way you do.
sure.
Sometimes now I will mention an incident that happened to my parents, and my mother will say, "Oh, that's because that teacher was anti-Semitic," or "Oh, that's because they were an anti-Semite." But I didn't know that at the time because we couldn't talk about it,
Hmm.
especially since I was a child. Look, I couldn't even be trusted with the fact that we were leaving the Soviet Union. Clearly, I wasn't going to be trusted with any other information. So, retroactively, I can say yes, but I didn't know it at the
Yeah.
time. I also didn't know things like my father, he wanted to be a doctor, but there were quotas for how many Jewish students could be accepted to universities. So my father was told that he couldn't be a doctor because he wore glasses. The doctor who told him that wore glasses. So these were things that affected my life, but I wouldn't have known about it because certainly my parents wouldn't have talked about it. They wouldn't have talked about it openly, especially not in front of children. So I can say yes, but at the time,
Okay.
kids always feel life is full of injustice because there's all sorts of things being done to you. Like you have to eat things you don't want to eat, and you have to sleep when you don't want to sleep. All the things. It's only later that I was able to find out that, yes, even at that small age, even in nursery school, my life was affected by it, but I didn't know.
Just also, again, I'm just because I'm curious. So, do you recall things like being said there about like America, the state-sponsored message at the time?
Well, again, I was very young. I do know that my father had set up some very complicated thing where he would listen to a broadcast while in a closet. So that was Voice of America. It's funny, I remember knowing that Voice of America was a thing without necessarily knowing what it was. I also remember how during the raid in Entebbe, we were actually on a cruise ship. And my father had some little ham radio that he was constantly walking around trying to get a connection. And as afterwards, like, they're free, they're free. No, nothing's going on. Everything's fine. Everything's under control. So those kinds of things, again, I knew them without knowing them. But I will tell you, when we were immigrating to the US, and at the time that we immigrated, the process was much longer.
Sure.
In that first, you left the Soviet Union because you were leaving with a visa to Israel.
Mhm.
Basically, because remember, the Soviet Union was a workers' paradise that nobody would ever want to leave.
Hmm.
So the only reason to leave the Soviet Union would be for what was called family reunification. So people would leave, their parents, their siblings, sometimes even spouses and children, depending on what was going on, to reunite with a third cousin in Israel they'd never met. But that was the paperwork. And then we went to Vienna. And in Vienna, Austria, was where you could change your paperwork to ask for asylum in America or Canada or Australia.
Hmm.
And then you went to Italy to wait
Wow.
for
Wow.
your time there. So it was a very different process. And again, when you were learning about America sort of on the way, like for instance, here's something I don't recommend. My parents were planning to come to California because they had a relative there. They read Grapes of Wrath. That's not really the book you should be reading when you're planning to emigrate to California. So, on the other hand, as my mother said to me, they thought all of America looked like Times Square because that was the pictures they had seen. So, when you ask about what did you know about America, those were sort of some of the spot images that we had access to.
Because yeah, like I said, I was living in Israel in the late 70s, early 80s, and in an absorption center there in Israel, and there were so many Russians at the time there too. We became friendly with many, but they were just, I mean, it was like a disproportionate amount from other countries of Russians in that absorption center. So I remember that was the time that
Right.
everyone
Well,
started.
the biggest wave, we were at the crest of it. We left in 76 and came to the US in 1977. It
Right,
really peaked in 79.
that's right.
And then
But it was
sort of the door was slammed shut. And you don't really see immigration from the Soviet Union again until the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 80s.
wow,
So it's like the peak period was in the late 70s,
right.
then again post-Soviet.
So you said so you left at 7. So what do you remember being told? What we're just going on a trip and that you and everyone was packing
Okay,
people
so
along?
here's the story. Here's the official story that little Alina, whose name was Ayla at the time, I actually changed it when I came to the US because most Americans can't say a yeah sound after a consonant, but Ayla was my name. So, okay, so my father had actually been working on his PhD when he couldn't be a doctor. He got a PhD in biochemistry. And he had just defended his dissertation. I was one of those 7-year-olds who knew the word dissertation and that you had to defend it. People thought it was very cute. No, so what I was told is that he had defended his dissertation and he got a job in another city. And that's where I was told I was going. Now, the thing you have to keep in mind is our tickets were for September 20th. School begins in the Soviet Union on September 1st. It's a major, major, major big deal, especially for me because I was 7 and I would have been going to first grade. You've seen all the pictures with the girls with the bows that are bigger than their heads, and everybody brings bouquets of flowers, and people on the streets are cheering for them, and it's the first day of school, and it's wonderful. Now, here's the thing. My parents were about to leave the country in less than 3 weeks. They did not want to bother with the performance art. They got me a uniform. They bought me a uniform. It was a wonderful uniform. It had lace right here. It was really great. But then they said to me, you know what? You're not going to go. So do I know why? I do not. Because it's the first day and everyone's rushing off to school and I'm sitting at home like the village idiot. Because I have no idea what is happening. So to answer your question, what was I told? Nothing. I was told nothing.
Wow. So okay, so you moved directly to California. That was the first place you
We
moved?
did. Well, I mean, after Austria
Right,
and
right, right. In the
to
States.
Rome, yes, we did. We moved to San Francisco, and then I lived in San Francisco until my 20s. And then I lived in LA for a year, and LA was really not for me. And then I came to New York, which is actually very interesting because now my parents live in Brighton Beach, and it's almost like the fate we always should have had, but we like avoided it for 30 years, and then we ended up back there anyway.
There are Russians in Brighton Beach. I'm shocked.
Brighton Beach,
Yeah, no, I'm
Brighton
kidding.
Beach, Brooklyn.
I
Brighton Beach,
yes,
Brooklyn
I'm from New
is
York. I know the area well.
Yeah, I was going to
I'm from
say, well,
Brooklyn.
what actually really amuses me about Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, is if you go there, there's a sign that says Brighton Beach, a whole new world, and then it's full of people who are trying to turn it into an old world. So it's a very interesting dichotomy of people living at in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn.
What was going through your mind at the time? Were you excited, nervous? Was it difficult to acclimate?
I was a very highly high-strung, anxious child, so everything was difficult for me. But when we came to the United States, I learned all sorts of fascinating. Keep in mind, when we came to the United States, I didn't speak any English.
Right.
Okay, well, that's actually not true. I knew 2 words. I knew the word apple because it was the first word in my picture book, and I knew the word the. How do you translate the word the? By the way, Russian doesn't have articles. It's a language without articles. So, but I was sent to a Jewish day school, which was actually very convenient since I didn't speak English or Hebrew. So that worked out. And this was long before English as a second language. This was long before dual language. This was, here you are, here's your school. And because we came relatively early, I was only the second Russian speaking school kid at the school. There was an older kid in one of the higher grades. It wasn't like later, like you talked about absorption centers, and also in New York, there were so many kids that actually they either had official ESL classes or there were just so many of them that they de factoed into ESL classes, but it was just me and I didn't understand what anybody was saying. Nobody understood what I was saying. It was just, a good time was had by all. And I learned all sorts of fascinating, yeah, I learned all sorts of fascinating things. Like, did you know that in America, you're not supposed to wear the same thing to school every day? I didn't. Did you know that in America there's a holiday, as my grandmother said, what's that holiday when they go door to door begging for food? I learned all sorts of fascinating things. I also learned that, did you know that in America, if you have a chest cold, you're not supposed to have what's called banki? I don't know if you're familiar with banki, but I will describe it to you. So imagine like the top of a light bulb, that shape, but a much thicker glass. And what you do is you take a wire and you wrap it in some gauze or some cotton and you dip it in either rubbing alcohol or drinking alcohol if that's all you have, and you set it on fire. And then you put the flame underneath the glass, which gets the oxygen out. And then you put it on your back and it goes.
Okay.
Now I found out that it's called cupping and it's actually very big in the homeopathic community. But let me explain this to you. You see, after you remove the cup, it leaves a perfectly round brown bruise. If you go to school in America and your back is covered with 15 to 20 perfectly round brown bruises, there will be questions. Sure. So those were just some of the things that I learned about life in America.
So as a kid, you later on became writing. We're going to get to all the writing things that you did. So were you a big reader as a kid?
Oh, I was a huge reader as a kid. Well, my parents claim my first words were pencil and paper. I think that's probably a little bit apocryphal. But I was that kid who they gave me a set of blocks, and I know I was supposed to build with them, but I gave them only, but I was also a huge reader. It's actually very funny. Just this weekend, I was telling my husband, I don't remember what we were talking about, but how he feels like everyone who came from the Soviet Union read the same, like 3 or 4 children's books. And as I said to him, because my husband literally rents a storage space for all of his comic books because, no, he's a big reader, but
he, my own heart.
Yeah.
A lot of times. Yes.
He had much variety to choose from. In the Soviet Union, we all pretty much had the same selections. I mean, there were fairy tales. There were the Brothers Grimm. There was a lot of Astrid Lindgren, who wrote Pippi Longstocking. Actually, she also wrote a series called Carlson, Who Lives on the Roof, which was actually a much bigger deal in the Soviet Union. It's very rare here. I had a hardest time finding it even translated into English. And then you had Krokodil Gena, which was an alligator who plays an accordion, and his friend Chiburashka, who is a creature of some sort. Maybe he's a bear, maybe he's a rat. I don't know. But there was a cartoon series, but pretty much everybody read the same stuff because we were very limited into what was allowed.
Which was your favorite? What was your favorite book?
Okay, let's see. I really like Carlson, Who Lived on the Roof, even though it is a little weird. See, it's a little man, a little Swedish man, and he has a propeller on his stomach, and he flies into this kid's apartment, and he keeps creating havoc. Now I could write a PhD about how it's very similar to The Cat in the Hat and the anarchistic spirit. But at the time, that was one of my favorite. I didn't like Pippi Longstocking. My mother said after she read it to me, I said, that is a very badly behaved girl. So apparently Pippi didn't do it for me, but I really like Girls That Who Lived on the Roof.
So when did you first start showing an interest in writing?
See, when you say writing, I think storytelling.
Okay.
And storytelling comes even before writing. Like I remember in my nursery school, when the teacher had to leave the room, she would put me at the front of the room so I would tell a story to keep the other kids engaged. So writing is just writing down stories. I really think of myself more as a storyteller.
Okay, but what was the first thing that you wrote?
Oh God, I don't even know.
No. Huh?
There was something scribbled on something. I can't remember. I mean, I started writing books, and for people who are just hearing my voice, they can't hear me going books and showing the little quotations with my fingers. But at 5, 6 years old, I was writing books. I was also making people listen to my stories. Boy, was I making people listen to my stories. I was a slightly bossy child.
So one of the things in your bio is that you're a soap insider, and I was reading. So when did you first start getting into soaps when you moved here, and that helped you learn English? I read.
Yeah, well, here's the nice thing about soaps. Soaps are very repetitive, and I say that in the nicest way possible because what happens on soaps is something happens, then people talk about it happening, then people talk about people talking about it happening, and it's a really great way to learn language because a movie is a self-contained thing. It's just a straight narrative, and everything just happens sequentially. The way that soaps are structured is the idea is most people don't watch 5 days a week. And I've actually been privy to the market research, so I can tell you that from a purely professional standpoint, is that people don't watch 5 days a week. So the assumption is people watch between 2 and 3 days a week. So they need to catch up, which means people need to repeat the information. And
Lot of
that's
exposition.
really, really,
Right.
really good for learning a language because now you can learn the words for what you saw happen, and then they get reiterated over and over again.
Well, I mean, I lived in, besides Israel, I lived in Mexico for a couple of years as a kid, and going back to comics, I read a lot of Spider-Man comics, and that helped me learn Spanish. So, when did you first start, I guess, understanding them? When did that hit? How long did that take?
Well, here's the thing. I remember that we came to the US in January of 1977, and I started school pretty soon afterwards. My brother was born in June of that same year, and I remember standing in front of the class talking about how I had a little brother. So it must have happened at some point. There's no point where I can point to and say, I speak English now. But I very clearly remember, and since I know when his birthday was, that I knew that by June, I was confident enough to stand in front of the class and announce that my little brother was pink and he looks like a little pig. That was my report.
So you got your degree at San Francisco State University, so right, and you began working as a writer for E! Entertainment Television,
Yeah.
like talk show, Pure Soap. So
Yes.
how
It
did
was it was a talk show about soap
soap
operas.
operas, right? So how did that all come about? What were your responsibilities? To watch them and report on them?
Well, first to how it came about. Remember how I said I was a bossy child? I was also
Okay.
a
Yes.
very arrogant adult. Basically, this TV show called Pure Soap came on the air, and I watched it. And they had asked a question that the host answered incorrectly. And so I wrote a letter to the host, and I said to him, I like your show. It's great. It's missing only one thing, me. And here's why. Because you got that answer incorrect, and here's the correct answer. And apparently, I was told that he walked into the executive producer's office, put my letter on her desk, and said, hire her. So that's how I got the job is actually the interesting part. And then what it was is I don't know if you ever watched E's sort of signature program was a show called Talk Soup,
Yes.
which had initially been hosted by Greg Kinnear, in
Mhm.
that he showed clips of talk shows and talked about them. So Pure Soap was supposed to be the same idea. We showed clips from soaps and then talked about them. So yes, it did mean keeping track of all at the time were 10 soaps on the air. Soaps were already on their way down. This was 1994. At their peak, there were, over 20 shows on the air. By that time, there are 10, but it's still a lot more than now.
But you started afterwards. You started writing for an actual soap, right?
Well, afterwards, I ended up moving to New York and I worked for ABC Daytime and they covered the shows. I was General Hospital, One Life to Live, All My Children. There was a show called Loving that was about to turn
Right.
into The City then. So I wrote the episodes that sort of transitioned that show into the next one. I wrote what they called wraparounds, which is something that they basically had one of the actors explaining, well, now this is going to be this. So I wrote some of that. And then I ended up at Procter and Gamble Productions, which owned As the World Turns and Guiding Light. And for those shows, I wrote tie-in books. I wrote a book called Oakdale Confidential, which was a tie-in to As the World Turns, which was a New York Times bestseller, which I think actually surprised a lot of people because by that point, people didn't realize that many people watch soaps. But yeah, a lot of people still watch soaps. And then I did another tie-in book for them called The Man from Oakdale. For Guiding Light, I did a book called Jonathan's Story, which was actually a character was off the canvas. And so this was the story of what was happening with him in the time he was off the canvas before he came back on. So, and then after that, I worked for All My Children and One Life to Live. There was a brief period after they were canceled by ABC. They were revived by a company called Prospect Park, and so I worked for those shows. So I did a lot of different
So
things.
you did from one letter writing in about a fact, you became a creative director.
Yeah. Well, not immediately. That
I
was like
know.
a decade
Yeah.
in between, but yeah. Yes, and that's where I ended. I was a creative director at Procter and Gamble by the time both those shows were canceled. By the way, you want a show canceled? Hire me to work on it. I have a phenomenal record of being hired to work on shows. I can kill entire genres. I also worked for ABC Sports in their figure skating department when figure skating was at its peak, with Nancy Kerrigan and Tanya Harding and the Whack Heard Round the World and all that. So when I went to work for them, it was figure skating was getting higher ratings than like Monday Night Football. By the time I was done, yeah. So you need something killed, but I should have warned you before coming on this podcast. That's I have
It was a good run. It's okay.
it's okay, good. You just
Yes.
so you know, in case you want, if something happens, you'll know why.
So you also you had a documentary out, like Soap Opera 451, which was going
Uh,
to be now a book as well.
Yes, it is. It is a book. It's basically, I took the title from Fahrenheit 451
Right.
because one of the taglines in Fahrenheit 451 is when people ask what we're doing, we'll say we're remembering. And that was something that I started, as I mentioned, soaps were on their way out. Basically, as Guiding Light was canceled, and As the World Turns was canceled, then All My Children and One Life to Live were canceled. Now there's only, ABC only has one show, General Hospital. CBS only has Young and the Restless and The Bold and the Beautiful. NBC had Days of Our Lives, but that moved to streaming on Peacock. And a new soap, Beyond the Gates, just premiered on CBS, but compared to the kind of numbers we had back in the day. So I started my project, Soap Opera 451, in between, like right after all the major soaps were canceled, in that I asked fans to remember what their favorite soap memories were. And then I went to the actors, to the producers, the writers who had been part of it, and I did sort of behind the scenes of how those moments came together. So Soap Opera 451, A Time Capsule of Daytime Drama's Greatest Moments, is a book, but it's an enhanced book in that you can actually watch the clip. Like if somebody says, "Oh, I really loved Felicia's alcoholic intervention on Another World," you click the link, you can watch the scene. I really loved what Brooke's daughter Laura was killed by a drunken driver and her reaction. You click the button, you can watch the scene. So I was always trying to find new ways, but in the end, it's still telling stories. Different technology, different formats, but you're still telling stories.
It's amazing that I didn't realize there were so few soaps on still, like that you just said, because again, when I was growing up, they were like all over, just one after another. I did not realize that there are so few right now.
Yeah. So, but they're coming back, maybe. As I said, CBS just premiered a brand new one, Beyond the Gates. It premiered just a couple of months ago. So who knows? I personally and single-handedly am going to beat my drum, and then I hope other people will beat their drums. And on the other hand, as you mentioned at the beginning, so my upcoming historical fiction novel, which is called Go and Pretending,
I ask about that for sure. Yes.
a section of it is set during the very early days of soap operas when they transitioned from radio to television. And the other thing to go in with this theme is I like to talk about Erna Phillips, who's basically the Jewish woman who invented the entire soap opera genre, and I made her a supporting character in the book.
That's great. So first, tell me about, before we get to that book, tell me about your path to publication. How did you first get agented?
Okay. Well, all right. Now we have to go back to the past.
Right.
Now the past is the year is 1993. And this is back in the days when two things were true. One, you could still submit unagented to some houses. And two, this is before email. I always like to tell children, yes, this is how we had to do it, children. First, we had to print the book out on a dot matrix printer. And I don't know if anybody remembers what that is, but it's the kind of thing that you had to watch it because it went bzz, 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 and if it got stuck, your entire book would be printed on one line.
Right.
So first you had to stand over your printer staring at it as it printed, as it spit out 300 pages or so. Then you had to put it in an envelope. Then you had to put in a self-addressed stamped envelope because you had to pay them to reject you because they had to send it back and send it through the mail. Now, you know how they say, write what you know. Well, what did I know? I knew about being a Soviet immigrant. So I wrote books about that. And the feedback I got in the mid 90s was nobody cares, Russia doesn't sell, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of rejection, lots of back and forth. Till finally, I got a phone call from an editor at Avon Books. And she said to me, nobody cares, Russia doesn't sell. But she said to me, you can clearly write. So I usually publish new writers in the genre of Regency romance. Do you want to try writing that? And I said, sure. And then I hung up the phone and I said, what's a Regency romance? Now, if it was now, I would know because like Bridgerton's the hottest thing on Amazon. So I went to the library, checked out 8 books. Yes, I was that nerd that knew 8 was the maximum number of books you could check out at the public library. And I read Regency romances. I said, oh, okay. So Regency romance, it's a romance set during the time of Regency England, which is like 1811 to 1820, Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Jane Austen, etc. Okay. So what do I know about Regency England? Nothing. What do I know about Jews? I know about Jews. So I snuck some Jews into Regency England. And I wrote what at the time was sort of the requirement, which was 3 chapters and an outline. And I sent it to the editor. And she called me back a week later and she said, I love it. I want to see the rest of my manuscript on my desk next week. And I said, it's not edited yet because that sounded better than it's not written yet. So I wrote it. And I sent it to her, and that ended up being the first book that I had published unagented because you could still do that. It came out in summer of 1995. It was called The Fictitious Marquis. And about 20 years later, I found out that the Romance Writers of America named it the first Jewish own voices historical. Mm-hmm. Own voices meant that it was the first time that a Jewish writer had put Jewish characters in a Regency novel. Now, Julia Quinn, who writes the Bridgerton series, she's Jewish herself, but her characters aren't Jewish. And Georgette Heitner, who was sort of known as the godmother of Regency romance, she had Jews in her Regencies, but she was notoriously anti-Semitic, so you can imagine how well that went. So apparently it was the first time in 1994, which is when the book was bought, was the first time that a Jewish author had put Jewish characters in a Jewish Regency. 1994, not 1894, not 1944, 1994. A friend of mine said to me recently, you were a trendsetter. I said, I was an accidental trendsetter. Never occurred to me that it hadn't happened before. I just wrote it because that's what I knew how to do. So it was after I actually, as you know, as in most fields, success breeds success. I only got an agent after I had already sold a book. And I've been through several agents. This is actually one of the things that I tell people. I get dumped all the time. I have editors who leave publishing houses. I have agents who move on. So it's a process. It's not the first one. I can't remember, my 4th, maybe.
I'm on my 4th, so it's okay.
Yeah. So as you know, it's a process. It's never like when I sold my first book, it's like, oh great, I'm never going to be turned down again. And when I got an agent, it's like, oh great, yeah. As you know, that's not going to happen. So yes, I started with Regency romances, then I moved into contemporary romances. Then I did a series of figure skating murder mysteries, which was based on my time. As I mentioned, I had been at ABC Sports. Then I did the soap opera tie-ins, and now Go On Pretending is my 3rd Soviet historical fiction.
So let me ask about the others, because I read you had The Nesting Dolls and My Mother's Secret. So those came about because now it's cool again to write about that.
Exactly. I remember I was having lunch with the agent I had at the time, and she said to me, Russia is really hot right now. And I said, I can't imagine why. I don't know what's going on. So yes, The Nesting Dolls, which came out in July of 2020. By the way, if anyone ever asks you, hey, want to release a big hardback book during the pandemic? Say, no, right. That doesn't sound great. But that's what happened. So it came out in July of 2020, The Nesting Dolls. And then My Mother's Secret, a novel of the Jewish Autonomous Region, was November of 2022, which is about Birobidzhan. I
read that on the site that you sent. That's fast. I urge people to go. Can you explain a little about that? But I urge people to go and look that up to read it.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff. So basically, when I ask people what was the first independent Jewish state of the 20th century, people either look at me because they suspect it's a trick question, or they say Israel. But as it turned out that over 20 years before the establishment of the State of Israel, that great friend of the Jews, Joseph Stalin, gave the Jews their own independent homeland, which is on the border of Russia and China. It's between two rivers, the Biro River and the Bijan River, which is why it's called Birobidzhan. And it is an area that was going to be an autonomous Jewish region under, fine socialist values. And thank you to Comrade Stalin. And here's the funny part. There's many funny parts. Here's one funny part. People came from all over the world, not just people from inside the Soviet Union, not just people from Eastern Europe, people from Western Europe, people from Latin America, people from North America. Americans sold their possessions because you had to pay for the privilege of being allowed to move there, sold their possessions and moved to Birobidzhan because they were going to build the world's first and only, and at the time, it seemed like the only homeland they were going to get in the early 1920s, and they were going to build this in Birobidzhan. So the other funny part is, many funny parts, is that status was never revoked. So technically, Birobidzhan is still an autonomous Jewish region. At this point, it's only 1% Jewish. And if you go down the rabbit hole that is YouTube, which when one is doing one's research for a book during that aforementioned pandemic is pretty much the only thing you can do. I found a documentary from 2012, which was about Birobidzhan. And so they show these children, these adorable children, mostly ethnically Chinese and ethnically Korean, because of where it is, who are sitting in their classrooms and they are singing happy Yiddish songs. Because as the teacher explained, we learn about the history of our town, of our region. And part of that is these adorable Asian children singing happy Yiddish songs. So if you ever want to go down that particular rabbit hole, you can go on YouTube, look for Birobidzhan. There's also a movie from the 1930s called Seekers of Happiness that's available on YouTube that isn't a combination of Russian and Yiddish, which was a propaganda movie that my mother and my aunt vaguely remember having seen, which was supposed to convince Jews to move to Birobidzhan. That's online. And there's a book by Masha Gessen called Where the Jews Aren't, which is a really good history. I think it's called Where the Jews Aren't, the Sad and Absurd History of Birobidzhan. So my book, My Mother's Secret, a Novel of the Jewish Autonomous Region, is set in Birobidzhan.
Fascinating story. I had no idea about it until I started, doing the research for you. And it was just incredibly fascinating. So I do urge people to go check that out. But again, all right, so let's go on. Let's talk about Go On Pretending. So again, can you give a little bit more information? You started giving a little cursory thing about it. What's it about? The impetus behind writing it?
Well, here's the thing. When I wrote The Nesting Dolls, the Nesting Dolls took place in 3 different sections. The first took place in the Soviet Union during the 1930s, which was Stalin's Great Terror and all of that. The second section was the Soviet Union in the 1970s, which, as you and I just talked about, was the Jewish refusnik movement and all of that. And the present day section was modern day Brighton Beach, which we also talked about for a reason. And the feedback I got from readers was they were most interested in the first section, the 1930s, because for very obvious reasons, Western Europe gets the bulk of the attention of the 1930s and 40s. And what I heard from people was I had no idea what was going on in the Soviet Union for Jews and other people in the 1930s. So when I did My Mother's Secret, a novel of the Jewish Autonomous Region, I set the bulk of it in the 1930s and Birobidzhan. And here, the trouble that readers had was believing what I had just said earlier was that Americans would leave the United States and move to the Soviet Union. So when it came to doing my third book, Go On Pretending, as you can see, I sort of let whatever people are interested in, I let it roll over into the next section. And so I thought about, let's write about the fact that, yeah, there were Americans who defected to the Soviet Union for a variety of reasons. And then I started thinking about why would someone move to the Soviet Union? I mean, to be fair, in the 1930s, one of the things I stress when I talk about Birobidzhan is there was a depression on. It was a worldwide depression, but people were told there is work in the Soviet Union. There was work. It was practically slave labor work, but there was work. So people made sort of a sensible decision, which seemed sensible to them. There were also the true believers, the people who actually believed in communism, everyone from Emma Goldman to Paul Robeson. We all know the names. But I started thinking about, so who would move from the United States to the Soviet Union? Who would think they'd have a better life there? Now, full disclosure. So as we heard a lot about my background, my husband is African American. And so we have as I say, we have a interracial, interfaith, intercultural family. And I started thinking, well, if it's the 1950s and you're an interracial couple in the United States,
Mhm.
and this is a decade before Loving v. Virginia, although interracial marriage was always legal in like New York and California and some other places. But, or no, in California it was legal by then. It wasn't legal at one time. But anyway, so if you're an interracial couple and it's the 1950s, you might believe the propaganda that the Soviet Union is putting out, especially, and now we get to another set piece. In 1957, the Soviet Union held a pro-democracy festival. Yes, let's all take a moment to ponder the Soviet Union holding a pro-democracy festival. Now, once again, this was during what they called, Khrushchev's thaw, when Khrushchev had just taken over for Stalin, where he had denounced Stalin at the 20th Party Congress and told the world about everything Stalin had done and explained this wasn't the fault of communism. Stalin was a bad man. It's not the system. It's not the system that Stalin built. It's not the concept of communism, which cannot stand the idea of anyone disagreeing and pretty much kills anyone who doesn't. No, no, no. Stalin was just a bad man, a little hiccup. Otherwise, communism is
Right.
perfect.
Yeah.
So Khrushchev, he wanted to show the world how the Soviet Union was the new Soviet Union, and he did. He did institute some reforms. He did some economic reforms. He allowed a bit more freedom of the press. Again, it wasn't all completely in his mind, but in 1957, he threw the World Youth Festival, which had youth delegations from all over the world. Again, not just Europe, Asia, and Africa, and all of that came for a festival. If people are familiar with the song Moscow Nights, which actually sort of became an international hit, it comes from that festival. Also, in case people are curious, what comes from that festival is what in the Soviet Union was subsequently referred to as the Children of the Rainbow. As you can imagine, after a brief sojourn in the Soviet Union, 9 months later, there was quite a Children of the Rainbow. But it was a festival which was set up to show the world how welcoming and wonderful and accepting the Soviet Union was. And if you were an interracial couple from the United States who had been invited to put on your production of Othello, a Marxist version of Othello, which is actually about the fact that it's all about class struggle. And actually, that isn't my idea. There's been a lot of people. The beautiful thing about Othello, it's probably why Denzel Washington is doing it on Broadway right now, is it really can be interpreted in so many different ways. And there is a Marxist reading, has to do with the fact that even though Othello is the main character, he actually doesn't have the largest number of lines. I believe Iago does. And it's all about class struggle rather than race. Great. Shakespeare had a lot of ideas. But so you have this couple and they come to the Soviet Union where they are, and this is the part I stress, where they are treated like celebrities while being told that they are treated the way every single other person in the Soviet Union is, they might be inclined to believe it. And so you have this interracial couple moving to the Soviet Union because they believe, or they've bought the sort of the PR. You talked about propaganda earlier, that the Soviet Union is a classless, raceless, non-sexist, non-anti-Semitic society.
Utopia.
So, sorry?
Utopia.
Yeah, Utopia, exactly. Remember that one that nobody would ever want to leave, which is
Yes.
why they're reuniting with their third cousin in Israel. Exactly. So Go On Pretending came out of the fact that people didn't believe that Americans would move to the Soviet Union. And while it is true, I created a fictional couple to illustrate that.
So, okay, so right now the book is out. By the time this comes out, the book is out in May. So how many of your family's experiences did you put in there?
You know what? Everybody always asks me about all my books. They always ask, how much of this is based on your personal experience? And I said, you know how when you open a novel, it always says at the beginning, no characters related to anyone living or dead. That's my story, and I'm sticking with it. But, well, it's actually funny because in the Nesting Dolls, which is a multi-generational saga, and I have the youngest character dating an African American character. And as my oldest son said, I don't know why people think the character of Gideon is based on dad. Gideon grew up in Harlem, went to private school, and then went to Caltech. Dad grew up in Harlem, went to private school, and then went to MIT. They are clearly
Nothing
completely
else.
different people. So I don't know. So honestly, if anybody sees anything of that, so when I was talking to my daughter, actually, when I was writing a section of Go On Pretending, I said to her, okay, so I need you to imagine, can you imagine that you're the daughter of a Soviet Jewish soap opera writer and an overeducated black man? And my daughter went, I think I can do that. So, and the question I actually had for her was, I said, if you had lived your whole life in the Soviet Union, because we had actually just gone to Moscow in 2019, we were visiting my oldest son who was doing an internship there. Boy, did we get in and out under the wire. But we visited in 2019, and so she saw how the demographics are very different. I said, if you had lived your whole life in the Soviet Union and you suddenly came to New York as an adult, which is what my character's adult daughter does in the 1980s. In the second part, I said, what would jump out at you as the most striking thing? And my daughter said something that I wouldn't have thought of if I hadn't asked her. She said hair. I would have been so stunned by all the different types and textures of hair and all the things you can do with it. Because one of the things, there's also a scene where my character, after they've moved to the Soviet Union, because, all good Soviet girls wear their hair in, braids, she's forces her biracial daughter's hair into braids, even though it doesn't really stay that way. And it makes like a little fish hook. That's very much from life experience because I used to, with my own daughter's hair, that's where I learned it. But it was so interesting that when I asked my daughter what she thought would be the most striking thing, she said hair, all the different ways you can do hair. But as you can tell from that question, the characters are not based on anyone in real life at all.
Oh, okay. You also write for places like I saw Today Show Parenting, Feller, and many others. So
Yes.
how did all that start? How did you become involved with these places?
I have a lot of things to say about a lot of stuff. I do a lot of I do a lot of education writing because one of the things that we live in New York City, and as I like to say, New York City schools are the gift that keeps on giving. I write multiple columns and there's always some scandal to write about. So I write a lot about education. My husband's a teacher. I like to say we're a very sexy couple. We sit around and talk about education policy. That's what we do. So a lot of the parenting came out of the education piece. Also, I have three kids. I have three very different kids. And although it's like you've met one kid, you've met one kid, but I write about my experience. And I mean, we had fun little things like my younger son dropped out of Stuyvesant High School, which is considered, the top public school in the country. He dropped out because he was bored and thought he could do a better job educating himself. So I think when I write stories like that, people go, huh, at least I don't have her kids.
So, okay. So the question is, what are you working on next?
For the first time in a long time, I have books that are just out on submission. And the one that I have out on submission now is called Admit None, an NYC schools mystery. Because since I write a lot about New York City schools and people do very crazy things in order to get their kids into schools, we heard about, what was it, a couple of years ago with the college, the Varsity Blues scandal, what people do to get their kids into college. Guess what? They do very similar things to get them into kindergarten.
I read
So
that as well.
I,
Yes.
so I put it in a genre piece in that it is a mystery and it's set in the world of New York City schools. But what it really is about is, everyone wants to do the best for their kids and everyone is afraid that they won't be up to the task. And that can lead some people to some pretty intense, let's put it this way, places. So right now, what my agent is shopping around is Admit None, an NYC schools mystery. Hopefully that'll find a home and then everyone can find out all the secrets about New York City schools that I can't write as nonfiction. And in fact, all of my career in a way has been fictionalizing the truth because, for instance, I worked at ABC Sports in the figure skating department and I had so many great stories. And people say, well, when are you going to write your book? And my answer would be when I no longer want to work in this industry. So I did the figure skating mystery books where everything is just fictionalized enough that nobody can sue me, but it is the stories. And it's very similar to actually both the books. Go On Pretending is behind the scenes at soaps, all the things I couldn't put real names to. but actual stories. And the same thing with the NYC Schools mystery. It's all the stories that I know, but I can't write as nonfiction because I still would like to remain employed. But it's ones that I just fictionalized. I hope it'll be fun. I hope it'll be fun for people because, like with the skating mysteries, people are like, is so and so so and so? Is so and so so and so? Maybe.
Right.
But again, can't sue me. No relation to anyone living or dead. So, yes, it's May, and the book that I have out now is Go On Pretending, which is available everywhere. And my other books, such as like The Fictitious Marquis, The Jewish Regency, that's available, and all of my soap books. So I have a big backlist, and my current book is Go On Pretending.
Fantastic. I look forward to that. And how can people follow you on social media?
Thank you for asking. So my website is alinaadams.com. My Instagram is I am Alina Adams. My Facebook, here's where it gets interesting. There is an Alina Adams media page. That's me. But there's also Alina Siverinovsky Wickham. Also me. As you can guess, for obvious reasons, Alina Siverinovsky did not scream Regency romance, which is why my very first editor is like, let's change that to Alina Adams, which is actually so funny because then I married a man named Wickham. Wickham is straight out of Pride and Prejudice, but it's too late. I've become Alina Adams. I have so many names that when I call people, I always have to stop and remind myself, who do they know me as?
Exactly. Well, Alina, I want to thank you for coming on. It's been such a pleasure getting to talk to you. Fascinating stories, and I learned so much speaking to you as well. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, again, this has been The Jewish Lens. I'm Jonathan Rosen. Again, a very special thanks to Alina Adams. Get the book, Go On Pretending, and please like, comment, and subscribe.
Thanks for tuning in to The Jewish Lens, where all items used was strictly kosher.